Thanks, Ariana. Can y'all see my screen?
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, really excited for this conversation today. I appreciate y'all taking the time to speak with us or to engage in this conversation with us. I'm gonna introduce myself and then pass it to my colleagues, my co-conspirators to introduce themselves. My name is Trevor Smith. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the director of narrative change at Liberation Ventures. And I'm really focused on thinking about how we can build narrative power, which we define as the ability to tell stories and shift mental models and cultural mindsets throughout the reparations movement. And really appreciate or really feeling honored to be in this space today. So I'll pass it to my colleague, Dreisen.
Thank you so much, Trevor. I'm also honored to be with fellow co-conspirators today. My name is Dreisen Heath, she, her pronouns. Tulsa-born reparations organizer and strategist and advocate. So it's spent several years researching as well as organizing communities across the country and advancing repair. That has also included in-depth narrative change work, which I'm so glad that we're talking about today. Jean-Pierre.
Thanks so much, Dreisen. It is an honor to be here. My name is Jean-Pierre Brutus. I'm a senior counsel at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, and I am also the convener of the New Jersey Reparations Council. I lead the Institute's reparations advocacy. And once again, I do want to reiterate that it's a wonderful honor to be here. I'm really excited, and especially with my fellow panelists, it's going to be good, I think. And I want to pass it over to Rich. Oh, and my pronouns are he, his as well.
Hello, comrades. My name is Richard Wallace, he, him, his, founder of Equity and Transformation. And we are based in Chicago, Illinois. I'm also the son of Reverend Doris Green and Mike Smith. I have two fathers. The other's name is Eugene Wallace. And their work, their legacy is really the work that I lead now. It's a continuation of that work. So just wanted to bring them into the space as well. And I'm excited for this conversation. And hopefully we can unpack and actually create some practical outcomes for the folks that are on the call. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Pass it back to you, Trevor.
Thanks, Rich. And just to like emphasize, I think the point to how committed I think all of us are to this space, to this movement. Jean-Pierre is on vacation in Paris. Rich had to move, some on the ground things in his calendar to make it here. Dreisen just got off a flight earlier this morning. And so just want to shout out to them for the work that they do, and then also for making the time to be in this space and to be with y'all. So as Rich was just alluding to, we're hoping to really provide some clear, concrete goals and outcomes coming out of the space today. We want to be able to provide some clarity on all of the different aspects of a reparations process. We'll be able to dive into this deeper. I think one of the biggest issues that we face is that reparations is seen mostly through a financial lens, and as we'll talk about, it encompasses much more than that. We want to be able to provide a clear roadmap for how you all can kind of host a conversation about reparations within your organizations, and that's what the breakout groups will be for, to get a little bit more clear on that, and then give some concrete examples of some specific campaigns, both at the local level, but then also at the national level, which Dreisen will talk a little bit more about, that hopefully can be fuel for some inspiration for future action. Just a couple of guardrails. Hope you all know that this is obviously the beginning of a conversation, not the end. The conversation about reparations in the United States has been is an ongoing one. It's a long-standing one. And so those of you who are kind of entering, if this is the first time that you're kind of talking about reparations, we welcome you. We invite you to continue the conversation in whatever capacity kind of makes sense for you. And all four of us, I think, are here to answer any questions both in this space and beyond it. Let's try to assume good faith, especially in the breakout groups, particularly for those who are engaging in this conversation for the first time. And that leads into the next one. There's no question that's a dumb question in this space. This is a very large and complex topic, and we want all of the questions so that we and others who are kind of in this movement, we can take all of those questions and all of that information back to our groups, to our organizations, to the folks who we're organizing with, and help it inform our future strategies. And then trust the moderation. I think when we're in the breakout groups, you know, Jean-Pierre, Rich, Dreisen, myself, we're going to try to kind of move things along so that it's, you know, going in a direction, in a concrete direction. So just trust that process and bear with us. So just wanted to use a couple, you know, very quickly touch on some of the terms that we'll be using today. Particularly, we're going to try to always link the conversation we're having about reparations back to narrative, since we are in this radcom space. And so just want to start off with using Manuel Pastor and Rhonda Ortiz's definition of movements, which they define as a sustained grouping that develop a frame or narrative based on shared values that maintain a link with the real and broad base that's always seeking to transform power. And so I want to start off with this because I think oftentimes narrative and narrative power is divorced from social movements. And I think in the kind of reparations narrative lab, which we'll talk a little bit more about, like what that was over the course of the year, the four of us have really thought about how narrative is involved in the reparations movement and not divorced from it. And then the next three, you know, we'll obviously hear throughout the presentation. Narrative, which you define as a collection of stories we tell each other, rooted in shared values and common themes. And we know that these are not the only definitions that folks might use, but it's the ones that we were using at Liberation Ventures and throughout the Reparations Narrative Lab process. Narrative power, which we define as the ability to tell stories that shift mental models and cultural mindsets that define our cultural norms. And then narrative change, you know, an intentional effort to shift the stories that guide our values and shape how people make meaning of information and experiences. And so we'll always try to, you know, round back to these definitions as we're having this conversation about reparation. So I'll pass it over to Dreisen to ground us a little bit in what we're going to be talking about today.
Thanks so much, Trevor. And I think that launches us really well into this grounding. We're all here today to talk about reparations, and you know, I think the gag is, despite what narratives you may have heard about it being not feasible, not possible, it's actually very possible and has been routinely done over the course of history, all dating back all the way to the 1700s. And so I'm sure there's other examples not documented, but we have clear enough evidence that reparations are possible. They just have not been administered, you know, consistently or at all comprehensively for descendants of enslaved Africans and the legacy of slavery. And so when we talk about, you know, what is possible when the names of Belinda Sutton come into the conversation, which Trevor will talk to more, we're talking about, you know, the Compensated Emancipation Act in 1862 that, you know, the only people ever compensated for chattel slavery reparations were the slave owners themselves for their loss of human property. You know, just a few years after Italian Americans were given compensation by the federal government for being lynched. We know that Black folks have been primarily the victims of lynching over a course of a century or more. We're talking about indigenous communities and Native communities who in the early 1900s started getting some form of compensation for seized lands, as well as, you know, allocation to, you know, paternal trust, which these amounts are to be debated whether they are proportional to the crimes of genocide and land theft that has been experienced. But we know it's possible. We know official apologies are possible in addition to resources. We also have more recent examples of this. The 9/11 Victims Restitution Fund is a reparations package, including compensation, mental health benefits, healthcare benefits, education benefits, as well as something you may have heard just driving down the street or listening to your TV of any victims impacted by the toxic wastewaters at Camp Lejeune. White veterans, primarily over 3 million veterans, are receiving comprehensive reparations now as a result of that exposure. Think of all the Black communities across the country experiencing toxic waste exposure. And so we know it's possible. And Belinda Sutton is a powerful way to bring us in this conversation, Trevor.
Thanks, Dreisen. And yeah, I just want to very briefly talk a little bit about Belinda Sutton, who is one of, the first, if not the first, kind of notable cases of reparations for slavery in an individual sense, obviously, in this country. And I want to uplift it to ground us in this discussion that reparations are possible, that we are on a trajectory where reparations for Black people in this country, will be made. And so Belinda Sutton, claimed that she had been denied the enjoyment of wealth that her enslaver had accumulated, and she successfully petitioned the court for 15 pounds and won, and was given 15 pounds and then 12 shillings per year from the wealth of the family that enslaved her. And we want to be able to bring this specific story up again to emphasize that reparations are possible. There's precedent for it, both in other communities, as Dreisen has talked about, but then also for slavery. And then obviously there's a wealth of information of the country acknowledging the wrongs of slavery. And I think it's all of our duties to kind of hold their feet to the fire and hold them accountable. And so a piece of homework that we want to assign here is to look into Belinda Sutton's story more deeply. If you just Google her name, you'll be able to see her petition. You can read the direct petition that she wrote that won her reparations individually. And then there's also a great book by Ray Winbush that talks about Belinda in the context of the broader reparations movement. And so just want to uplift obviously her own words, and then some research and some writing by another OG in this space. I'll pass it back to Dreisen to talk a little bit about what we mean by reparations.
Yeah, so what are reparations? What do we mean? This slide addresses basically the UN's definition under international human rights law for which reparations is defined, the various forms that it can come in. And this is applicable to the United States because the United States has signed into various treaties that require it to abide by this law. And it's very clear as day. You have restitution, which an example of that are just measures to restore a community back to the condition that they were prior to the wrongdoing, prior to the crimes. That might be restoration of liberty, that might be return of land, return of artifacts, return of employment, place of residence, return of property. These are all things that are considered under restitution. Compensation, which is the most kind of culturally accepted form as we know it in terms of a definition. But that's monetary payment for any accessible, economically accessible damage. It's also been used to compensate moral and spiritual and mental losses. We've seen there be calculations and accessibility of what the compensation would look like in response to not just physical harm, but also mental harm. When we talk about rehabilitation, that's provisions of medical and psychological care. So what would it look like for Black folks to never have to pay for mental health care or to have trauma-informed care in order to provide some buffer and intervention to the anti-Blackness of this world? Satisfaction measures, I feel, are the things that you see the most. And these are the monuments, the memorials, the memorialization, which is important. If you go to places like South Africa, you don't walk, more than a mile without seeing a reminder of apartheid, of what happened there. And so when we talk about commemorations and tributes to the victims, preservation of historical memory, not deprivation, and also formal apologies by which, in the case of chattel slavery or any other anti-Black violent institution, The US government has not issued an official apology, though some have been introduced in prior legislative sessions. And then guarantees a non-repetition, which I feel like is the most underrated of the forms. This is ensuring that the abuse never occurs. How do we ensure that this crime does not happen against this group of people or another group of people ever again? And that may include institutional or legal reforms. That also is a conversation about abolition. What institutions have been built in order to, extend exploitation and dehumanization rather than equal access to life and, increasing of livelihood and survival.
Thanks, Dreisen. Very comprehensive, but quick overview. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem that's kind of at hand. And I think the biggest problem is that folks don't generally understand reparations in the way that Dreisen just described it. It's mostly seen through a financial lens. So diving a little bit more into it, the problems at hand are both like public understanding and public support. So over the past 20 years, support for reparations has increased, but it still hovers in the low 30 percentile. And so one of the things that we truly want to do is both like expand the public's understanding of reparations, but not in a way that waters it down, in a way that still rings true to the tenets that Dreisen just talked about, while also increasing public support. Another thing that we realize that we're up against is that there's a disconnect. So there is like a pretty like collective understanding across the country of the problem of structural racism. So what you're seeing here on the right are 2 points from two different surveys. A 2022 survey found that 58% of people across the country believe that structural racism is real, that it's a problem that should be addressed. And then we contrasted that on this graph with the fact that only 30% of people support reparations. And so what we need to do as a movement is make that connection to show that reparations is one solution, maybe not the only solution, but one solution to addressing structural racism in this country. And then one of the big things that we talked about over the course of the past year in the Reparations Narrative Lab is this notion of a hope gap. And so what you're seeing here on the right is support on the top half of the graph is support for reparations within the Black community. So support for reparations in the Black community kind of hovers around the high 70s, low 80 percentile, but belief that it'll happen in this lifetime is less than 10%. It's actually 7%. And so we call that gap between support and belief the hope gap. And so Black people obviously generally support reparations. It's something that it's something that the Black community generally agrees on, but belief that it'll happen is obviously very, very low. And so in thinking about how we build a strong choir and build a strong base to be able to mobilize on this topic, I think we need to be able to close this hope gap within the Black community, really inspire Black people to be able to see that reparations is possible, something that can be attained. And so we're thinking about how we can do that both on the organizing level and on the storytelling level. So I just want to touch on very, very quickly on like why narrative is so important. And so on the right is a picture of Queen Mother Audrey Moore, who is seen as one of the like OGs and of the modern reparations movement. And organizing, I think, organizing is very important in regard to social change and shifting mindsets and reframing issues. And so I want to be able to talk about in this discussion the role of social movements in the reparations movement in shifting overall narratives, not just related to reparations, but related to Blackness, deservedness, narratives around meritocracy. So when we talk a little bit about the narrative roadblocks later on in this discussion, you'll see that some of them are specific to the reparations movement and some of them are broader, relating to narratives of capitalism, imperialism, colonialism. And so in my view, I think reparations can kind of serve as both like a meta narrative, in addition to being a social movement, to really transforming our ways of thinking and being in relation to each other, particularly on the concept of race. So very quickly, the four of us over the past year were a part of the Reparations Narrative Lab, which was convened by Liberation Ventures. And we were inspired by kind of other narrative collaborations that came before us. And so on the left, you'll see just a very quick list of some of our inspirations, such as the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, which convened experts to think about economic narratives related to poverty, and the Butterfly Lab, which started in 2020, which was around immigration narratives. And on the right, you'll see the narrative system that the Butterfly Lab created through their cohort. And so we were also inspired by different narrative frameworks. And so we brought together 13 activists from across the reparations movement to co-create a narrative framework. And so we looked at some other models. So on the left, you'll see Race Forward's narrative pyramid. On the right, you'll see Pop Culture Collaborative's narrative system. And so we really wanted to think about what would it look like to bring together experts, organizers, folks who are on the ground on this issue to co-create something similar to this, something that would work for the reparations movement. And so what we landed on was what we call the narrative house. And we hope for it to be a schematic, less of a framework, which we think is a little bit more rigid, a schematic that can help anyone who's interested in telling stories about reparations organize their thoughts and make meaning of what we mean by reparations in a way that aligns with the broader movement's narrative and those tenets that Dreisen talked about earlier. And so we are in the very final stages of developing this schematic. It'll be out in September, and it will address and hopefully be able to move us past some of the narrative roadblocks that we'll talk about later in this session. So what we're talking about today are some of the roadblocks that we have identified throughout the Reparations Narrative Lab. And I'm gonna pass it back to Dreisen to talk about reparations at the federal level and like what that conversation looks like currently.
Thanks, Trevor. Just to name that, we wouldn't be anywhere with any reparations legislation at any level, let alone a national level, if there wasn't grassroots organizing and pressure to move reparations as what was seen as a fringe issue to a mainstream understanding. So we don't get here without Queen Mother Moore's work. We don't get here without Randall Robinson's That's So we don't get here without James Forman and SNCC's Black Manifesto. And so I just want to name that because sometimes policy has a disconnect from people's demands. And, hopefully over time, we're going to see that the policy actually reflect what the people want and not what is feasible in a establishment. And so HR 40 has been introduced every Congress since 1989. It was first introduced after the Civil Liberties Act, which granted Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II reparations, as well as education benefits and later pardons for people who resisted wartime detention. And so there was an opportunity of hope. HR 40 didn't have any more than 50 something co-sponsors before 2019. And then there was a groundswell. There was a change in the legislation that changed it from just a study to a study and recommendations. And then there was more organizing on the ground to get support for this. And so in the 117th session, currently we're in the 118th congressional session. In the 117th, there was over 215 co-sponsors. And in that Congress, you need 218 to pass legislation out of the House. And so we gained the 3 additional votes, but there was still roadblocks and deliberate decisions by, Democratic Party not to advance HR 40 on the House floor. It was passed out of Judiciary Committee for the first time in over its 30-year history. And so strides, but still not quite, and lesser of progress on the Senate side. But it is still viable legislation, and that call legislatively within Congress has turned into a call for an executive order for this Federal Reparations Commission to be set up. And so that's where we are with HR 40. Knowing that HR 40 is being deliberately stalled in Congress, despite all these institutional, state, and local efforts, Congresswoman Cori Bush stepped up to the plate and introduced a comprehensive framework, a holistic framework that describes what a Federal Reparations Commission would even examine. And so HRES 414 is that, details that in the resolution, and also calls for the immediate passage and establishment of a Federal Reparations Commission, as well as the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission, which I'll get to shortly. But it's a first of its kind framework that she did introduce that not only documents historical harms, but also present day harms, which we often miss in the narrative conversation about reparations for Black people, is that this is not just about chattel slavery and other kind of historical harms. It's also about present day anti-Black discrimination. And so Congresswoman Barbara Lee has introduced the U.S. Commission on Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. That's HConRes 444 in this year's Congress, which is a commission supposed to be modeled somewhat after the truth and reconciliation processes that we've seen in South Africa and Peru and other countries, with a particular focus on examining the impacts of chattel slavery. So this would also be an opportunity through the transformation part to examine what reparations looks like. And that is kind of the bulk of what we have in terms of reparatory justice legislation at the national level, making it very also a clear admission of no direct implementation bills currently in Congress that would just grant compensation or grant other resources that are necessary. Next slide.
And yeah, sorry, I'm taking a bite. Just on this side here, we just want to very quickly ground reparations within the broader movement for Black lives. And so, reparations is increasingly becoming part of, Black power building platforms and legislative agendas. And I think we're seeing more and more organizations, if they're talking about the racial wealth gap, reparations is being included in that. And from my perspective, if you're talking about the racial wealth gap and more specifically the Black-white wealth gap, reparations must be a part of that. And then we're also seeing folks talk a little bit more about how reparations fits into a broader economic agenda, particularly from scholars like Derek Hamilton, who are situating baby bonds and reparations next to each other and not as an either or. I'll pass it to Jean-Pierre to talk a little bit about, like a little snapshot of reparations at the local level, and then talk a little bit about his work in New Jersey.
Thanks so much, Trevor. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think, just a little in terms of context, Dreisen and Trevor wonderfully laid out sort of the national and federal aspects of reparations. And I want to say that, there's a tremendous amount of energy at the local and state level for reparations advocacy, as Trevor alluded to, in part because of the movements around, the George Floyd protest. And after 2013, we've seen this kind of resurgence around reparations advocacy, and it's manifested particularly at the state and local level. And just, some historical context, in '94, there were some reparations given after Rosewood Massacre that happened in 1923, where there was a small Black community, where there was a race riot in which a white mob basically destroyed a Black community, basically for Black folks getting out the kind of position that was imposed on them. And so there was a $2.1 million sort of reparations package that was given. There were scholarships given to the descendants of those who lived in Rosewood. And then similarly in 2015, Chicago gave back a 5.5 million reparations package for a long-standing sort of concerted effort by the Chicago Police Department to torture Black folks, to get false confessions out of them from 1970s to 1990s. By another police commander, John Burge, which is like a very notorious folks who have been to Chicago or have lived in Chicago. This is pretty well known that this was engaged basically torturing and Chicago's own citizens and so there was like the mayor of Chicago had to apologize. The package included also Chicago Public Schools had to include in their curriculum discussions about torture in Chicago public schools. So there are multiple aspects to this 5.5 million package. And then, I think perhaps for many folks in the popular imagination, the most famous sort of reparations initiative right now is Evanston, which has, right side of Chicago, has sort of centered their work primarily first around housing, and now is expanding it to include other elements of reparations, which I think is wonderful. And they're certainly leading the way as well as Asheville, North Carolina. And then I want to get a little closer to home here in New Jersey and California. And I'll talk a little bit more about New Jersey, introducing the bill in November 2019. But California really has kind of set the tone for passing their bill in February of 2020, introducing their bill in February 2020 and getting it passed later that year in September of 2020, and then actually releasing their final report just recently in June. Given that they're the largest state, given that the first mover, their reparations report is going to have a significant effect on other task forces around the country at the state and local level. They're essentially the Kerner Commission of the 21st century in many ways. And so next slide, please. And so this is the context in which New Jersey is operating in. And so, as I said before, because of the kind of energy and momentum around racial justice issues from the protests around the murder of George Floyd, we began to see this kind of energy and renewed focus around racial justice issues around a number of different issues. And in New Jersey, led by Assemblywoman Shavonda Sumter, who's the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus, a bill was introduced in November 2019 to introduce a statewide task force in New Jersey. There was a lot of meetings between legislators and different stakeholders throughout the state and people. And one of the things legislators would say and powerful folks in New Jersey would say is, why call it reparations? Why not call it, a wealth disparity task force? Why not call it even a Black Lives Matter task force? Everything but reparations. And so the Institute, which leads the coalition, was like, hey, this is why we need to call it, say the word, right? There is this constant fleeing from the term reparations. We need to name it. We need to call it out. We need to identify it, right? It's important when you're identifying a problem to actually name what is the solution, right? We can't run away. And that was the organizing around, say the word. We were very intentional about that. And so our work in New Jersey, the coalition that we lead at the Institute, it's a multi-faith, multiracial coalition, called Say the Word to continually raise reparations, to address slavery in New Jersey. So New Jersey tends to kind of skate away from the notion of slavery, particularly in the North, because it's seen as progressive, even though New Jersey has been called the slave state of the North by historians. Black activists in the 20th century called New Jersey the Georgia of the North. New Jersey was very steep in slavery, right? It was the only state in the North to support the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. It only adopted the 13th Amendment after it had been ratified. It was New Jersey's primary form of labor during the 18th century. So, many folks don't realize how steep New Jersey was in slavery. And so this is kind of the work that we've been trying to do as part of the coalition to build support at the grassroots level. We've gotten a number of folks, legislators, to support the bill, but the bill hasn't moved, primarily because the two most powerful people in the legislature don't want it to move. And so the bill hasn't moved, even though this bill has more co-sponsors, both in the Assembly and in the Senate in New Jersey, than many other bills that move and pass. So it's not a reflection of co-sponsorship. So because of this lack of movement, the Institute felt, we can't wait around for the legislature to do the right thing, right? It was November 2019. California has already, released a report, right, which is having an effect, changing the conversation. So we felt we would launch our own reparations task force. We're calling the New Jersey Reparations Council. We launched it on Juneteenth of this year in Perth Amboy, which is a major port for enslaved people. Senator Cory Booker was there, Mayor Ross Baraka was there, the mayor of Perth Amboy, Assemblywoman Shavonda Sumter, as well as our co-chairs, Dean Tajania Henderson and Professor Khalil Gibran Muhammad. Now, the council is made up of 9 committees, including History of Slavery in New Jersey, Segregation in New Jersey, Criminal or becoming Public Safety and Justice, Democracy and Justice. We also have Economic Justice, Segregation in New Jersey, as I said before, and we also have Health Equity, and we also have one that's unique to our council that other councils do not have, Faith and Black Resistance. And we're very intentional and thoughtful about narrative. So we have a Public Education and Narrative Committee, which Dreisen is on, thankfully. And as Trevor alluded to earlier, the economist Derek Hamilton is a co-chair of our Economic Justice Committee. And thinking about, how do we talk about reparations in New Jersey? What is the context for state and local reparations in the national context? How do we link together the past to the present? How do we get people to rethink or re-narrate the history of New Jersey to understand how New Jersey was a leader in some ways in the North of slavery and also Jim Crow, right? And then also to think about making policy recommendations to address those harms and atrocities and to build it to transform New Jersey. And so the plan is to launch and to release a report on Juneteenth of 2025. We'll have 2 in-person sessions on Juneteenth of 2024 and Juneteenth 2025. And we'll have our first public session for the history of slavery in New Jersey, which will invite public comment, September 26th. It'll be virtual, 6:30 Eastern. You'll see flyers out for that soon. And so the idea is to change the conversation around New Jersey, around not only history of slavery, but Jim Crow, New Jersey, and ongoing institutional racism, and what can be done in terms through the lens of reparations. And so that's the work that we're doing. And hopefully we can set a blueprint not only for New Jersey, but for the legislature in New Jersey, and then for other commissions and task forces around the country. And so I just want to be brief, and I want to pass it over to my colleague, Rich.
Yes, hello everybody. Rich here again, and so I guess I know I'm supposed to give a bit of history on the fight for reparations in the state of Illinois, the city of Chicago. So many of you may know that the Great Migration from 1916 to 1970, millions of Black folks began to migrate to places like Chicago, and they were escaping Jim Crow laws in the South. Similar to narratives that are used today, which is why it's important. There was a narrative that was surfacing by majority white Chicago residents, and they claimed that the influx of Black folks that were escaping Jim Crow laws strained the city's resources, right? That was the terminology they used, which is a narrative that's based on scarcity, right? There won't be enough for everyone. Those same narratives are being used right now in the city of Chicago as it relates to the racial tensions around immigration. There won't be enough. And a lot of these it's actually like how we are as Black folks are holding similar narratives that were like used on us as it relates to immigration in Chicago. So they're not using new tactics. These are old tactics they've been using for forever. And so those tensions led to what we now know as a state approved housing policy known as redlining, right? And so some of the first, advocates came out of that tension, out of that narrative of scarcity, and there was an opposition, and opposition was demanding reparations, right? The modern push for reparations gained momentum in the 1960s and 70s as activists demanded compensation for historical injustice, including slavery and discrimination. In Chicago, grassroots organizations like Reparations at Home movement began advocating for reparations for African-American communities affected by redlining. In the 1970s and 1980s, lawsuits were filed against banks, lending institutions, that held discriminatory lending practices. And I think it's important, I think I made an important note that it was state. So oftentimes people think that racism is like one white person saying some racist things to a Black person, right? Like that's not that. It's not you not liking me is not the issue. The issue is when the state supports you not liking me, right? And so that is what we're wrestling with. It's not, we're not wrestling with a bunch of people who just don't like us. We're wrestling with a state and who embodied, you know, those dislikes and produced policies that extracted value from our lives, extracted people from our communities, right? And so moving forward, you know, in 2006, the city of Chicago passed a landmark ordinance acknowledging the city's role in slavery and racial discrimination called the Slavery Era Disclosure Ordinance, and that was in 2006. The ordinance urged corporations and institutions to disclose their ties to slavery before they could actually, so there's a process called procurement. I used to be an organizer around inclusive procurement. So procurement is essentially the way that the state or the city spends money, right? So we have contractors that work with us every year to build infrastructure, build buildings, whatever the contract might say. And so essentially what this, what the Slavery Era Disclosure Ordinance was supposed to do was they were supposed to disclose their financial history in order to prevent folks who had participated in the slave trade from benefiting from public dollars. And so that happened, and it was passed in 2006. Yet in 2020, this is why it's unique, right? So policy can get us so far, but in 2020, Mayor Lightfoot, then Mayor Lightfoot, requested to see the results of the ordinance, and to this day, they haven't tracked one single procurement process and did any background on any company that has ever procured money from the city of Chicago, and as it relates to like and disclosing, you know, their relationship to slavery. So although the ordinance was passed, it's on the books, it's not being used. And so moving forward, I think a victory that we could be excited about was the Chicago police torture reparations, right? We all, I mean, few of us within our circle know Joey Mogul, who played a instrumental role in this process. But ultimately there was a racist police officer, it's nothing new, who his name was John Burge. I'm from Chicago. I've heard stories. He was kind of like the boogeyman. He would literally torture our brothers and sisters into confessions. There are hundreds of folks that were forced into false confessions. And he would use tactics that he learned in the military and literally put electric generators on people's bodies and tase them, electrocute them into confessions, right? And this ordinance that was passed for survivors provided compensation and services to victims. They're still fighting right now currently for infrastructure around that. But I know a number of Burge torture survivors that came home and actually received compensation. So it did its job to that extent. In addition to that, there is housing reparations for redlining. Chicago became a pioneer in 2021 by establishing the Evanston Local Reparations Fund. Many of you have heard about what happened in Evanston. This program aimed to address the lasting impact and effects of redlining, providing housing grants to Black residents, and investing in community development. And the continued advocacy, I think, this is where I kind of feel like, you know, Equity and Transformation, the organization that I founded, is part of a long history of agitation, of fighting, and Black advancement in the city of Chicago. And our lessons and what we do now is no different than the Black Panther Party of that era. And they were passed. I mean, I think that the legacy of their work was also passed down from other future generations or past generations. And so in 2019, Chicago took a step towards addressing these issues when it passed a resolution acknowledging the harms caused by the housing policies, and committing to study the potential reparations initiative. And I'm going to fast forward to 2019. Our work began in 2018 around recreational cannabis, and the name of the campaign is A Big Payback. And so in 2018, we began to organize Black informal workers. These are folks that are boxed out of the formal economy, to engage in the recreational cannabis fight. We saw an $8.1 million $8.1 billion industry headed for the city of Chicago. We saw a host of folks that were activated in the cannabis economy, in the legacy cannabis economy, and we thought that they needed to fight, and we advocated and organized. The city council voted in 2019 to create a reparations fund using revenue from legal marijuana sales, which led us again to the Big Payback in 2018. We began our campaign. We fought for and won the first policy to incorporate drug war reparations in the state of Illinois. And currently we have a campaign that's called the Big Payback that is focused on, ensuring that the state commits to the initial interpretation of HB 1438, which was the Recreational Cannabis Tax Act, and that they provide real compensation to survivors. Right now, we were able to fight for and win 25% of the cannabis tax revenue, and it's supposed to be allocated to community, but it's only showing up in the form of grants. And so the misinterpretation there is that, and the eligible entities to apply for those resources are nonprofit organizations. And for us, we are vehemently saying that nonprofits are not the survivors of the war on drugs, the people are. And so opposed to giving that money to nonprofits to run programs, give that money directly to the people. That's one of our demands. In addition to that, we won 800,000 expungements. We won, the social equity applicant designation. There's a whole lot of equity measures that are in there that are relatable to the 5 pillars of reparations that we're talking about now. But we decided to kind of revamp that effort and say clearly what it is that we mean and what we want in the city of Chicago. And so we advanced our campaign, which is called the Big Payback. Currently, we have recently we released the vision for drug war reparations, which is a comprehensive document that it entails and details what we mean when we say we want reparations. And we are in the process of building policy and advancing policy in the next iteration of the campaign. So that's a bit about our work. We're led by formerly incarcerated and system impacted people. And again, the name of the campaign is the Big Payback. I'll pass it back to you, Trevor.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Yeah, appreciate you, Rich. We're just going to talk a little bit about the narratives that stand in our way. And everything is up for discussion in our breakout groups, but we thought particularly we could ground our conversation there in the narratives that stand in the way. And so over the course of the Reparations Narrative Lab, we landed on these 10. These are definitely not the only 10. We're going to run through like how we define each of these very quickly before we transition to breakout groups. But just noting that that these are not final. We haven't released the final report or the final schematic yet. But obviously wanted to be able to preview them with you all today. And then 2, that there's like more research to be done. The way that we gather these is through intense and constant conversation with the folks who are on the front lines of this conversation every single day. And so that's how we landed on this 10. And there's, I think, more quantitative research and qualitative research that can be done to really try to understand, what are the mindsets, what are the narratives that are up against on this that we are up against specifically on this topic. But we feel pretty confident in this list. And so I'll pass it to Dreisen to talk about the first 4.
Thank you. So, we hear this notion that essentially that tries to erase the existence of racial capitalism, or the fact that, Blackness and race was created as a social, a system of social order and caste. And this myth that, white people are actually the targets of racism and discrimination because they have to hear about the marginalization and historical and present marginalization of Black folks. And so any wink of consciousness or any speaking of equal opportunity and of equal standing is somehow some threat. And this reverse racism narrative is one that we see come up very often. The next roadblock we have is what, some would call Black irresponsibility. So this is, that notion that I examine this as like, how am I pulling myself up with my bootstraps without no boots and with injured and beaten hands, right? It's not possible, but there is a assumption that there has that Black people, are frivolous and anti-Black narratives that dominate the mainstream, that Black folks can't take care of their finances or they'll go buy Jordans. But no, there's no dominant narrative that questions Holocaust survivors for their decision making and how they use their reparations. So it's not about blaming any one individual, as Rich spoke to very eloquently earlier. These are state-sanctioned crimes and policy practices that are built to maintain this particular social order. The third one we have is the racial progress roadblock, which is honestly one of the most annoying to me. Yes, we can, see what we've gained, and we can also see what has been lost, compounding, because we have not addressed wounds that continue to be, stabbed into. And so, you hear the Biden administration a lot of times when they don't want to act on reparations, they say, we're doing racial equity measures now. And, we are, I've heard people say to me directly, like, you are in shackles. And maybe physically right now, but I can't say that about friends and family members incarcerated. And I certainly can't say that economically and socially, when there's felony disenfranchisement, when there's predatory lending, when there's maternal mortality rates amongst Black women that are indescribable and, mirror what harms look like during chattel slavery. So just a point of, even relevance, this weekend, March on Washington will have its 60th anniversary, where Dr. Martin Luther King, came to the Lincoln Memorial and also talked about insufficient funds and a bounced check that the U.S. owes, and the sanitized version of MLK's work in leading up to the March on Washington largely leaves out that demand that was clear as day. And the recognition that the racial wealth gap, by the data we have today, is actually worse than it was prior to the passage of the Fair Housing Act and Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act that was culminated as a response to some of this activism around the March on Washington. And so the fourth narrative roadblock we have is what we're calling right now diaspora clashing narratives, which is an internal struggle. What, I think also what Rich spoke to eloquently earlier was this taking of our own traumas and using it against each other, taking traumas that were beat into us and using it as a us versus them within the Black space. And so there are very clear lines being drawn in the sand of certain people are not owed reparations that are Black, and different time periods determine whether or not you would receive reparations under a specific program like California. But there is a recognition, a truthful recognition, that we all need to have around this being an intra-movement. We are within a global context of an international slave trade within colonialism and white supremacy that has impacted all people in the diaspora. And we can walk and chew gum at the same time and address the harms that are needed in its comprehensive nature and not leave anybody out.
So the next narrative block is just the cash. I think if you were to ask, the average person, or as it is popularly understood, reparations tends to be limited to just financial payments, particularly cash payments, right? And particularly, around reparations for Black people, the large sums are thrown out, and that's seen as radical, right? And it's a powerful thing to close the racial wealth gap. trillions of dollars, and that's significant. But that overlooks, right, both the history of the call for reparations by Black people, which has always been more expansive than financial payments. And when you look at the Black archive, particularly around demands for land, right, that's a proxy for what? Power, right? And so any kind of call for reparations also has to be transformative, because slavery and its sibling in arms, colonialism, established a kind of racial regime that was, established in 1492. And so when thinking about what reparations needs to do, and thinking about it expansively, we need to think about it more than just cash, because it's not going to alter the relations of power that have been established and maintained for long periods of time. Second, so I just want to raise that as now the next narrative roadblock. It's just too complicated, right? Too long ago, right? There's this kind of selective memory and the kind of selective historicization in which certain things from the past can be understood as being simply linked to the present. So people can draw on July 4th, right? People can draw on other historical myths to think about themselves in the present. But when it comes to slavery, comes to Jim Crow, these things are too complicated. There are too many aspects. And that's just used as an excuse to really think about how did slavery affect, the current moment? How does Jim Crow affect the current moment? How do we think about the institutional racism, right? The regime of institutional racism, sometimes called mass incarceration, right? Having this direct line to slave patrols, right, in the South and even in the North. So I think there's this way in which complication is a way to obscure, right, a particular kind of narrative, particularly a kind of history that we can make links of, and we can call this maybe in some ways a kind of a Black narrative as opposed to the kind of traditional narrative of the white gaze that's been going on for too long. So, and that's it for the two kind of narrative roadblocks that I have. And I'll pass it on.
Thanks, Jean-Pierre. Very quickly, the last three for me, this one we call the harm is everywhere narrative. This notion that, harm has always existed, that slavery has always existed. And we often see this show up from the conservative side saying, Africans sold themselves into slavery. So it's definitely one that is, hard to grapple with, but it's one that is often divorced from, as Dreisen was mentioning, the realities of the international slave trade and the effects of it, and how we have never really grappled with that, and the effects of colonialism and, frankly, imperialism across the globe. Then we have the other one, the meritocracy narrative, really the founding, or one that's one that is a kind of breathes life into the founding of this nation and quote unquote democratic ideals that anyone, no matter their race or gender, ethnicity, immigration status, disability, if they try hard enough, they can make it in this country. And so, we hear this both, from non-Black communities, the white community, and Black communities, that if Black people just kind of worked hard enough, they'd be able to make economic progress in this country. And not only do we know that that's not true, like qualitatively, economists like Raj Chetty have shown that quantitatively that's not true either. And then we have one that's called the market knows best narrative. And so, the notion that it's natural for wealth and power to be concentrated in the hands of a few, and that, that poverty and inequality are just inevitable features of life, inevitable features of life. But obviously, that is a tenet of capitalism, but capitalism isn't necessarily what the economic structure that we need to undertake. And then the last one, what we are calling it the universalism narrative. And this is the notion that universal policies such as guaranteed income or guaranteed healthcare, or just policies that disproportionately impact Black people, should be considered reparations. And so in the lab, we watched a clip with Bill Maher and Charlemagne talking about reparations. And Bill Maher was like, well, Obamacare actually was a form of reparations. And we do think that is dangerous to try to conflate or to try to situate policies that should just happen, as we talked about earlier, as part of like a broader economic agenda, as reparations. And reparations has a social, psychological, and spiritual component to it, as we saw in Germany for Holocaust victims and in other places as well. And so to try to say that just good public policy is reparations is really a slap in the face to the Black community. So I think we're going to move to breakout groups. Cool. All right. For our last 10 minutes, I hope that I know that the conversation can probably go on forever. We had a really good conversation in mind. I'm gonna pass it to the facilitators, Dreisen, Jean-Pierre, Rich, but obviously feel free to bring in other voices. Want this last 10 minutes to obviously be a space for reflection, a little space for conversation, and some action. You know, were there any actionable things that came out of the rooms that you all were in? Dreisen, I'll pass it to you first. And obviously folks in your room should feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I would love any additional reflections from the folks in my room. I think it was a very nice conversation that, you know, exposed to me, you know, community engagement being a key piece of this work that's often left out or deprived in the process, or seen as like some side project, right? Rather than the central piece to outlining the roadmap for what the reparations is going to actually look like. So hearing that in the context of work happening in the Berkeley Unified School District, also hearing about some of the internal themes that organizations are already working on that overlay with some of these, you know, things that we talked about related to the reparations space. So, you know, dismantling apparatuses of violence and building community power to heal. Like, how can that also be used to, you know, make these connections towards reparations? Also hearing, you know, there's different activity in all these jurisdictions, and uplifting, you know, the work of folks like Climate Chaos and Feed Black Futures, and you know, how you know, this work is deep. We didn't get to specific like action points. I think if we could have an opportunity, each person in my room, I know I want to be able to connect to other people that I know are in the space, or maybe would be helpful in providing support. And so if there's an opportunity to do that, you know, at some point post this forum, you know, I could also put my information in the chat, but a lot of good energy.
Thanks, Dreisen. Anybody else from Dreisen's room want to offer any reflections, thoughts, questions? Okay, I'll pass it over to Rich. How about you go next?
All right, sounds good. Yeah, we had a great conversation. We're just getting into it. Some of the things or the themes that surfaced was, you know, really, you know, shout out to Davana.
Yeah, Davana, correct.
Got it. Okay, got it. All right. I want to make sure, right? And the work that's being led in Missouri to build racial solidarity. And then Patrick, and the work that kind of like the legacy of work that's been going on in his area around around prisons and the prison industrial complex, and like ending the death penalty, and the intersections that has to the need to, you know, the need for a reparations framework to actually be advanced forward at almost every dimension of our work, right? Hurt people, heal people, came to mind when Patrick was presenting. And then also Robert Smith, and the work in philanthropy too. It's a struggle, right? And oftentimes I think that when we think about our work, it's like the advocates on the ground get the glory, but behind the doors, there's people that are inside that are moving money, moving electeds, moving other folks that are also in those. They're also, you know, they're mask wearing. Sometimes they are shape shifting in order to get the resources to the ground. And so shout out to Robert and the work that Robert's leading to you know, to bring about the resources to create, you know, the change that we are all fighting for. And so like everyone who was in our breakout talked about, you know, the work that they're leading to dismantle oppressive systems. And really what I got from them was really a vision for what advancement actually looks like. Sometimes in describing what we're deconstructing, we can come together with a vision for what it is that we're trying to advance. And it is a world without prisons. It is a world where workers workers come together regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera, right? It is a world where those who have more, in Robert Smith's case, share the resources and give the agency for the people who receive those resources to do what they feel they need to do with it. And so for me, it was kind of like a ceremonious experience where I was hearing stories, but there were similar themes that were cropping up. And I would love to hear from folks that were on the call or in our breakout session on, if there's anything else that they wanted to add. And we didn't get to the action points either because we didn't have enough time, but.
I think you did a really great job. And I would just add, I think spaces for people from different sectors to engage and organize and align on narratives, on strategy, get to know each other and build relationships. We always say that we want that. It's really hard to do. It's time consuming, but it's like, I think we have to do that, So figuring out what that looks like and creating more spaces for that that are spacious, so we're not rushing through, feels key. So we got to work on that.
Yes. I'll go real quick, then I'll pass it to you, Jean-Pierre. I mean, my group was amazing. I think two big threads popped out, just, radical solidarity across all oppressed communities, but then particularly in the context of the United States between Black and Native communities. And we talked a little bit about, what does, as both the Land Back movement progresses and the Black-led reparations movement progresses, what does it look like for us to share language? Because right now it does feel like there is some things that we have to figure out around, like, Black folks calling for land reparations. There's a land back movement, and how does reparations fit into a land back movement or vice versa? And so thinking about, creating spaces to have that conversation, particularly in the context of the United States, but then globally within all oppressed communities, all settler nations should be having this conversation. And then another one that we talked about was kind of like a mix of like the meritocracy narrative and the universalism narrative that we see internally at organizations who are committed or interested in equity, where a focus on Black people makes folks internally feel uncomfortable because they're like, well, we can't prioritize one community of color over the other because we stand for equity. And so I think that, to me, that just makes me think about, well, how do we have a conversation about talking about, the history of harm on specific communities that's also rooted in equity? Other folks from my breakout group, anything you'd add to that?
Sure. So I was in your group, and one thing that I thought was really interesting, and I can't remember their name right now, was the person who talked about like individual reparations. And I don't want to speak for them, so I'm not to call you out, but I was wondering if maybe you could introduce that conversation or bring that point in this space, because I thought that was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you. My name is Lathram. Since you can't see me, a little context: white settler lineage, ancestors been the South since late 1600, organized around land-based work in the South. And I was just talking about the role of story and narrative, specifically in white communities, to help crack open like our own involvement and our own complicity and sin and harm in this work, and really working towards what does it mean to grapple with that, with the legacies in your family. So not only are we thinking about reparations and reparative work around land, culture, money, all types of capital at like a citywide level, a national level, but also like internally and individually, and family to family. And there are some examples of that going on here, like mortgage payoff and truth-telling work and relationship building, but it's really slow and really complicated. as you might imagine or might have experienced.
Thank you. Yeah, it's something that we explore in the framework coming out, schematic coming out, like the role of identity across communities on this topic. Jean-Pierre, I'm gonna send it to you to bring us home because I know we're over time. We want to respect people's Fridays.
Sure, sure. So I'll be brief. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the folks who are in my group. Thank you for participation, for the wonderful work you're doing. And I think one of the, like a theme that I saw personally was this thinking about the specificity of the work that the folks are doing and linking reparations to that, right? And thinking through how to bring conversations reparations to either their colleagues or to the folks that they're educating, because we have a couple of educators in our group. But I think what I did find and what I appreciate is that folks, we did get a small chance to talk about some next steps, is that folks seem to appreciate sort of 10 narrative roadblocks that we've identified and how that would be helpful to reaching out to their colleagues or the folks that they're engaged with in terms of education. So I think that also is very helpful as a concrete step for articulating what many perhaps are unable to articulate for themselves. What we've identified through the narrative house, I think is something that I think will be very helpful for folks going forward. And I do look forward to continuing this conversation. But just thinking about how reparations can be understood more expansively and thinking about other people's work around racial and social justice through the lens of reparations.
Thanks, Jean-Pierre. And I'm gonna just say like a couple quick action points, and then I'm gonna pass it to Ariana. I think some things that could happen out of this space is try to have a conversation internally at your organization. Based off of this conversation today, I think hopefully, we're gonna have those roadblocks out soon. And hopefully that could be a way to host a conversation. Read resources that are out there about the movement. Google Dreisen, she's got a lot of stuff out there. Rich and Eat just published the vision for drug war reparations, and Jean-Pierre and all his colleagues and organizers in New Jersey have said a lot. And there is a lot out there on the specific initiatives that were mentioned today, but that just more broadly. As we mentioned, this is one of the oldest movements in the history of this country. So there's a lot of resources out there that and all of us, I think, are open to sharing our knowledge on what can be read. And then I think just lastly, just remember when you're having the conversation about reparations to frame it more than just the financial aspect. It is about the money, but it's not just about the money. It really is it's a transformative process. We're trying to dismantle the oppressive systems that uphold capitalism and white supremacy.